No, 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 no.
Bro knows nothing about Caesar in Gaul. This guy has been beating the same anti-Gaul Caesar boo drum for the past 2 months or something. The conquest of Gaul was to boost Caesar's political career and to gain military power, that is. If by preserve freedom you mean stop the Helveti's peaceful migration. The Helveti's peaceful migration. The Helveti's peaceful migration.
You serious?
In the year 42 BC, Julius Caesar was posthumously deified by the Senate of Rome. The historian Suetonius tells us that he was numbered among the gods, not only by a formal decree, but also in the conviction of the common people. At the first of the games, which his heir Augustus gave in the honor of his apotheosis, a comet shone for 7 successive days, rising at the 11th hour, and was believed to be the soul of Caesar himself. The words and deeds of Julius Caesar are legendary. But men do not become gods by themselves. They are made gods by those they serve and those who served them in turn. And today, we'll be talking about some of those great men of distinction. Some whose names have been remembered, while others forgotten. In either case, what survives of these men are their extraordinary acts, which Caesar himself attested to in his life and his commentaries. Caesar's ability to inspire and encourage his men was remarkable. Plutarch mentions in his account of Caesar's life that soldiers who in other campaigns had not shown themselves to be any better than the average became irresistible and invincible and ready to confront any danger once it was a question of fighting for Caesar's honor and glory. It was clear the way that Caesar loved his men, Plutarch says, by the ungrudging way in which he would distribute rewards and honors, that he was not massing a great fortune from his wars in order to spend it on his personal pleasures or on any life of self-indulgence. Instead, he was keeping it, as it were, in trust, a fund open to all for the reward of valor, and his own share in this wealth was no greater than what he bestowed on his soldiers who deserved it. Even more, Caesar proved that there was no danger that he was not willing to face, no form of hard work from which he excused himself. Suetonius writes that Caesar equipped his soldiers with weapons inlaid with silver and gold, which both improved their appearance and made the soldiers themselves more careful not to get disarmed in battle. When news came to him of the massacre of Sabinus and Cotta's legions at the hands of the Eburones, he swore neither to cut his hair nor trim his beard until they had been avenged. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be focusing on the Gallic War. If you enjoy it, then I will make a separate list for the Civil War as well. With that said, let's dive into it. 2 unnamed soldiers are mentioned during Caesar's expedition to Britannia. Both Britannic campaigns posed a particular challenge to the Romans, not the least of which was making the crossing from Gaul. The first crossing proved to be the more difficult of the two, as the native tribes had been warned of Caesar's coming and were prepared to meet him on the beaches. Caesar first stationed warships fitted with artillery machines and archers in a position where they could easily rain hell on the barbarians. The unfamiliar machines caused such a panic among the locals that they retreated a short distance further up the shore, giving Caesar's men a safer avenue to disembark. The legionaries, however, were wholly unaccustomed to the foreign sea, and hesitated until finally the Aquilifer of the 10th Legion stepped forward and shouted this to his men. "Jump down, soldiers, unless you want to betray our eagle to the enemy. I, at least, shall have done my duty to the Republic, and to my commander." After saying this, he flung himself into the sea, and began carrying the eagle of the 10th straight at the enemy, an act which put such shame into the legionaries that they all jumped in after him to avoid disgrace. Again in Britain, a different soldier, this time a common legionary, found that a group of leading centurions had gotten themselves into a marshy place and were being set upon by the enemy. The man rushed into the thick of battle, and with a gallant display drove the natives off and single-handedly rescued the centurions. Finally, he made his way back to camp after all the rest had gone ahead through the muddy stream from which he had come, sometimes having to wade or even swim through the water. Caesar and all the soldiers who were watching shouted joyfully as the man pulled himself out of the bog and returned to them safely, at which point he fell to Caesar's feet with tears in his eyes and asked to be forgiven for having let go of his shield. During the massacre of the Romans at the hand of the traitor king Ambiorix, another Aquilifer, Lucius Petrosidius, is called out for his selfless act. Caesar mentions several men by name in this battle, including Quintus Lucanius, a senior centurion who tried to save his son, who had been surrounded, and died fighting courageously. Petrosidius, with his eagle, managed to cut his way back to the Roman encampment with some of his comrades. Before he could get in, however, the enemy caught up with him, and, hard-pressed, he grasped his eagle standard and threw it over the ramparts to prevent its capture. He then turned to meet the enemy head-on, dying bravely shortly thereafter. Moving up the pay grade, let's talk about Caesar's outstanding centurions. Centurions, as you may know, were the backbone of the Roman army. Not only did they each command a century in battle, they were also responsible for training and disciplining their men outside of it. Centurions also acted as advisors to their often less experienced superiors. A certain centurion, one Publius Sextius Baculus, had the honor of being personally named by Caesar in his commentaries not just once, but on 3 separate occasions. The first time Baculus's name appears is during the surprise attack by the Nervi, where the 12th Legion became pressed to the point of nearly breaking. Caesar mentions that all the centurions of the 4th cohort were dead, and all but a few centurions from the rest of the cohorts were either wounded or killed as well. Among these casualties was our man, senior centurion Publius Sextius Baculus, who Caesar calls a man of immense courage. He was suffering from numerous serious wounds and could no longer stand upright. Many of his legionaries were weakening, and some in the rear were beginning to flee. Baculus survived this encounter, and he and the 12th Legion are mentioned again the very next year. Caesar had sent this one legion deep into the Alps in hopes that he could secure a route for men and materials from Italy. Initially, the legion, led by the legate Galba, won several victories over the Alpine tribes, receiving their surrender and a guarantee of peace. After settling into winter quarters, however, the tribes reneged on their agreement and started a siege of the as yet unfinished camp. The situation was extremely dire. Supplies were not yet secured, and the defenses not yet up to snuff. Here, when it looked like the worst might occur, Baculus, along with a military tribune named Gaius Volusinus, ran up to Galba and explained to him that their only hope was to try a desperate and sudden sortie, a plan which Galba heeded. This sudden turn to the offensive was successful, and the 12th was able to safely remove itself from the Alps into friendlier territory. The final time we hear of Centurion Baculus is in 53 BC. A few years later, no longer a man of the 12th, but now a leading man of the reformed 14th, the legion that had been utterly decimated by the traitor king Ambiorix. This new 14th was headed by Quintus Cicero, Marcus Cicero's younger brother. During this year, Caesar focused a large amount of effort on culling Ambiorix's tribe to the point where any Eburones who survived would grow to curse Ambiorix's name for the fate he'd brought upon them all. The sneaky Gauls, however, abandoned their towns and began hiding deep in the woods and marshes. Unwilling to risk the lives of his own men over exacting revenge, Caesar invited Germans across the Rhine and gave them free rein to pillage and loot the land of the Eburones as they saw fit. Unfortunately for Caesar, the Germans proved just as unreliable and as dangerous as the Gauls. And when they found out that the newly reformed 14th was in charge of guarding the entire baggage train of the Roman army, their greed overwhelmed their better senses, and they attacked the unsuspecting Romans. The timing couldn't have been worse, as Cicero had just sent out a large part of the legion to gather food and supplies from the surrounding countryside. The garrison left behind was so short on men that they barely managed to stave off the first wave of Germanic raiders. Centurion Baculus was one of these men left in the camp because he was ill, and further, he had gone a full 5 days without a single meal. As the legionaries had just begun to capitulate, Baculus emerged from his tent unarmed. Suddenly aware of the grave situation, he grabbed weapons off the nearest soldier and charged forward to defend the gate. The other men, seeing this, were so inspired that they followed him in, and together managed to prevent a rout. Baculus was badly wounded and lost consciousness. By dragging him back from hand to hand, the other soldiers just barely managed to save him. Without Baculus's brave actions that day, Roman losses would have been immense. Not all stories end as fortunately as that of Baculus. During the siege of Gergovia in 52 BC, Caesar made a play for a high ground position just outside the city that sat on his left flank. He achieved this objective along with his famous 10th Legion and sounded the horn to halt the advance. But the legion opposite his own, the 8th, either failed to hear or ignored the signal due to their belief that victory was near at hand. So the 8th charged forward and managed to breach the walls of Gergovia. The Gauls, however, were able to rally and began to push back, and it is here where Marcus Petronius emerges. Petronius, a centurion of the 8th, realized his desperate situation. Gravely wounded, he called to the soldiers that had followed him. "Since I cannot save myself along with you," he said, "I shall at least take care to secure your survival. For it was my desire for glory which made me lead you into danger. When I give you your chance, watch out for your own safety." At once, he plunged into the midst of the enemy, killing 2 and forcing the rest back from the gate. When his men tried to come to his aid, he shouted at them, "Your efforts to preserve my life are futile. Already my blood and my strength are draining away. So get away while you can, and make your way back to the legion." In this manner, he fell fighting, and in doing so managed to save all the men who had followed him. The last 2 men we'll be talking about today need no introduction. The heroes who stopped an entire revolt in a single moment. The bravest men who stepped forward in the most dire of battles. I am of course referring to the centurions, Titus Pullo and Lucius Vorenus. Made popular by the fictionalized versions of their characters that appeared in HBO's Rome miniseries, you'd be hard-pressed to find any reader of Roman history who hasn't heard of these 2. The real Pullo and Vorenus were both centurions, and had maintained a legendary rivalry between them. They were always competing for the most important tasks. It was around the new year of 53 BC. The traitor king Ambiorix had just successfully destroyed the 14th Legion, and now he and his nervy allies were marching against another legion, the 11th, led by Quintus Cicero. Fortunately for the 11th, Cicero was not about to fall into the same trap that Sabinus had, and after refusing to surrender to the rebels, a siege was started. Without going into details about the entire battle, which Caesar does in his commentaries, let's just say that the ordeal was grueling for the Romans. 9 out of every 10 men received wounds. Fires had been started in the camp, and the runners they sent out daily to try and get messages to Caesar had each been captured, tortured, and put to death before the entire camp. More than a week into the siege, while the fighting was reaching its climax, Pullo shouted at his rival as they worked the defense. "Why are you hesitating, Varenus? What chance are you waiting for of winning praise for your bravery? This day will decide the contest between us." With these words, Pullo leapt from the defenses and charged single-handedly at the densest part of the Gallic army. Varenus, not wanting to be outdone, leapt after him, and the two engaged the Gauls together. Pullo threw his spear, transfixing a Gaul who had run forward from the ranks, but then himself came under a hail of missiles. His shield was pierced, and a dart had gotten itself stuck in his sword belt, preventing him from drawing his weapon. In this way, he was surrounded and was about to be killed when Varenus burst forth to save his comrade. He killed one man outright, and drove those who had surrounded Pullo off a short way. In his zeal, however, he lost his footing and fell into a nearby hollow, and now was himself surrounded. Now it was Pullo's chance to save his comrade. With his weapon now drawn, he charged forward toward Varenus, killing many as he helped his rival get back on his feet. The two then fought together all the way back to the camp, to shouts and cheers from the entire legion that had just witnessed their astounding acts of bravery. Caesar comments that fortune played with them both in their rivalry and struggle, so that despite their enmity, each helped save the other, and it was impossible to decide which should be considered the braver of the two.